these are some laws that have been on the books since the 1800s. We still use part of that fugitive slave law for when a criminal has committed a crime in one state and then he flees that state to another state. And the laws of extraditing that person back, all of that still stems from your fugitive slave laws.
Like, what were the highlights in Brooklyn of the Underground Railroad? You know, where were those spots that people talk about?
Well, just right now, the involvement of the churches, just to talk a little bit about the churches. As we mentioned earlier, you have the old Bridge Street Church, the Plymouth Church of the Pilgrims, Reverend Ward Beecher. You've got the Concord Baptist Church. There's the First Church, that's down on Henry Street with Reverend Cox, who was very, very instrumental in the anti-slavery movement, he was also a great outspoken speaker against slavery. You also have, there's another church, and I really hate that I can't remember the name of the church, but it's over on Washington Avenue, which is very involved in the anti-slavery movement. And as we know, the old Bridge Street Church moved from downtown Brooklyn up into Bed-Stuy, which takes you up into Weeksville. And you had the church on the hill, and also the Berean Baptist Church. So it's a variety of churches throughout Brooklyn where the pastors and the congregation were very much so involved in the Underground Railroad.
As a matter of fact, the church has a reputation for this having been the Grand Central Station of the Underground Railroad. And I'm sure that that's based upon the reputation of the Henry Ward Beecher, for whom this church was, and this sanctuary that we're sitting in, was actually built. Beecher himself caused this sanctuary to be built in 1849. The church was founded in 1847, and it was founded in the old church, which is just behind this church, which we still now use, but it's used more for, it's called Hillis Hall, and it's used more for a reception room, large reception room, where we have our fellowship time after worship. But when Beecher came to this church, and he was a young man, obviously, he had in mind that he wanted to design a church in such a way that no one would be hidden from him, so that he could see everybody at the same time. And so this is a church not in the round, but it's a church that's has rounded pews extending out from the pulpit area, so that Beecher could move around on his pulpit and see everyone and address everyone, and they would all be facing him. And he could read people's faces, and he drew his energy from those people that he was preaching to. Granted, he was solid in theology and very current in his thinking, and his sermons were quite lengthy. I've read a number of them. They're filled with quotable quotes, but people were accustomed to sitting there for several hours or more just listening to this famous man. He did preach against slavery. He certainly practiced what he preached, in the sense that many of the paintings that are still available, and the old prints that are still available to us here in this church, portray Beecher as having purchased slaves from the South, twins, and obviously the famous Pinky slave, Rose Ward. And he would bring these young people, usually very young people, to this pulpit that we're sitting in front of, and he would auction them or have the congregation buy their freedom. And the congregation actually not only bought their freedom, but in some cases paid for the education of these folks. This was very risky, I'm sure, but Beecher had the freedom of his faith, a man of very strong faith, and a man of enormous power of speech in his sermons. He people were spellbound in front of him.
Now, a lot of times when slaves and black freemen would pass through Grand Central Station, which is what you're calling the Pilgrim Church, I want to know, did they have the time to reach back with their hand and try to help someone else, or did they have to really run like crazy?
Well, we know of a few, again, we're talking oral history here, and not much in the way of written history. We do know that word was sent back occasionally, that there were ways of reaching Canada. Most people did not, as they were passing through New York, did not stay for very long. It was a way station. By this time, they'd obviously, if it were winter, they'd obviously reached the cold. They needed food, they needed clothing, they needed shelter in order to make it further up north.
Signal?
Well, in the case of this church, the reputation of Henry Ward Beecher as being a famous, not only preacher, but compassionate man, was one, and also many of the members of the congregation were known to house slaves passing through on their way north.
In February of 1860, Beecher brought a little 9-year-old girl named Sally Maria Diggs here from Richmond. He had heard about her from another clergyman, that her mother and brothers were going to be sold south. And she was the family member who was brought here. It was, I believe, February 5th, 1860. On this pulpit, on this platform behind us, there was no pulpit here at that time, and Beecher literally auctioned her off to the congregation to buy her freedom. They passed the offering plate. That's how they got the money. And a woman in the audience named Rose Terry, an author, was so moved that she wanted to give more than she had on her in terms of money. So she took a ring off her finger and threw it into the offering plate. When the plate got up to the pulpit, Henry Ward Beecher took that ring out of the offering plate, put it on the finger of the little girl. Her name was Sally Maria Diggs, but they called her Pinky. Put it on Pinky's finger and said, "This is your freedom ring." She kept it all of her life, and then as an elderly woman, she came back to Plymouth in 1927. So that would be 67 years later. She returned the ring to the church. And this is it, Bruce. This beautiful, gold ring with a purple stone. We show it to school children. They're fascinated by it. That was, the occasion was the 80th anniversary of the church. Pinky went back to Richmond, lived with her grandmother after she was free, attended Howard University, or what is now Howard University. The church provided some financial assistance. And she met and married James Hunt, had two daughters. One of them, Eva, was here with her.
I had a great aunt. I know her as Aunt Rose, and it was many years before I discovered that she was the same Aunt Rose who was sold here at Plymouth Church, whose freedom was purchased, and she became a free person as a result of her experience here at Plymouth Church. My mother was a great collector of the family history, and I think she did it because, being the youngest of 13 children, she had been orphaned when she was a baby. The family had been split. They were in various states, and some went into orphanages. She was very fortunate to have been adopted by a cousin, and she resided in Baltimore, Maryland. There were 4 grown brothers at the time, and these brothers of hers kept her informed of all the other family members and visited them all. And she kept a very large pocketbook, a maroon leather bag with all of these pictures and information in it. Whenever it rained or the weather was inclement, she would bring out the bag, and this was a wonderful time. And my mother was a very, I would say, very expressive woman. She used her hands like an Italian woman does, and her eyes flashed, and she was very animated. And she would tell these animated stories about the relatives, explain who they were and whatever. And it was such a wonderful time for me, so I would beg her to bring that pocketbook down and let us see the pictures. And she had a wonderful picture of Aunt Rose and Uncle James and their daughter Flossie. When she passed on, she gave me some of the pictures that she had. I didn't think too much about Aunt Rose anymore after that until I was grown. And when I came to New York, I had an elderly aunt who lived to her 99th year. And I made it a duty for the 35 years I've been in New York each month to visit Cousin Gladys in Manhattan. And on one of her visits, she talked about Aunt Rose. And she said Aunt Rose came to see her back in 1929 when she came to Plymouth Church for the anniversary service. And she said she came to visit her at that time. So, of course, I wasn't too interested or about the matter at that time. But what she did, she followed up by sending me a little book called The History of Plymouth Church, and by Noyes, N-O-Y-E-S. And I read the story, but it showed in the picture, it was illustrated, and the picture showed a girl of about 15 or 16 years old being sold, you know, from the pulpit, or being auctioned, rather, at the pulpit. And I didn't think any more about it. I put it aside, having a very busy life. But later on, when I came to New York, I was involved with museums, and I was cultural coordinator of a museum called the New Museum of Brooklyn. It was the forerunner of the Brooklyn Children's Museum. Yes, we were located on Bedford Avenue. At that particular museum staged a wonderful exhibit called Blacks in Brooklyn. And one of the panels did depict this elderly woman, a newspaper article from the Brooklyn Eagle, giving a speech here at Plymouth Church and thanking everyone because she had benefited so much by what the church had done, purchased her freedom, helped her to go to Howard University, become a school teacher, realize some of her goals in life, and then, of course, she had married. And when I looked at the name, it said Hunt. My family name is Hunt. I looked at the picture looked familiar. I said, well, perhaps I'll go back to my cadre of pictures and see if I can locate this lady, she being a Hunt. And she married James Hunt, which I know that was my grandfather's brother's name. My grandfather was Josiah Hunt, and his brother was James Hunt. I went back to the pocketbook and pulled this wonderful picture up. And what impressed me so is I knew, even Cousin Gladys had said, that Aunt Rose was very beautiful, olive complexion, and she had a beautiful mole on her cheek. I looked for the mole. There it was in the picture. I went to the exhibit and looked on the panel and studied that newspaper picture very carefully, and there was that mole. I said, I know it. It's her. It's her. I went down to Annapolis, where the farm was that Rose and James lived on with my grandparents, Malvina and Josiah. They all lived together in Anne Arundel County, down in Annapolis. And I got the deed that shows that they owned the property. It had been turned over to them, and it had been turned over to them by Mr. Thomas Sorrell. Now, my mother's maiden name, her grandmother was a Sorrell, so I knew there was a relationship. And even the elder relatives told me that he was a white man, and then they said very quietly, but he had colored children. So that I knew that my maternal grandmother's property had been deeded to her and her husband, that's Malvina and Josiah, and to their brother, James, and his wife, Rose. And the reason being, they were the only literate ones. All right. So in 1883, that was March the 1st, they signed the deed that turned that property over to them. So I was very satisfied. I stood on the property and I looked around. I said, this is where my great-grandparents stood, and this is the property, this is the place where they lived. And it was so enriching to me. And I went to Rhode Island. I have a cousin there, Dr. Roscoe McKinney, who was a very renowned surgeon here in New York. He headed the burn department for Harlem Hospital during the time of the 1946 period of the war. He was one of the first pioneers in plastic surgery, one of the first to use penicillin. And I knew he would be an authority on family history because he was one of my elders. So I went to his wonderful home in Rhode Island, and we sat and talked. And he discussed it. He says, yes, I used to go down to the farm down in Annapolis and visit with Rose and James, Josiah and Melvina. He says, but when I went there, he said, I had to be on my P's and Q's. He says, because James was very strict and didn't take any nonsense. James and Melvina, the four of them, decided to leave the South, and they moved to Washington, moved a little farther up, and they rented homes. My grandparents lived at 234 Oak Street in Washington, and they lived 237. Then there was another uncle and his wife that lived a little farther along, so they were settling themselves in. And this is where their children were raised, and this is where Rose spent her life in Washington. The census lists my great-grandfather as a government worker, which he did become. But he was really a lawyer. He had studied at Howard University, James Hunt. He was proficient, but because of his race, he couldn't practice his profession. He turned instead to insurance and real estate, and he did very well. He became quite well off. He was able to hire help for his family. He had maids who waited on Flossie and Eva, his two children. And in fact, his wife had 4 children, but 2 were lost. Flossie grew to adulthood, but she also passed on. I got to know Eva. And that was another little leg of the journey. As I got a little older, I think I was about 15 or 16, I used to compete in competitions with the National Association of Negro Musicians. I was a musician, I was a pianist, and I would compete in their contests, earn enough scholarship money to further my studies for the year. And my teacher kept me going with these contests, and that helped my mother to pay for my lessons because she really couldn't afford them. And this year, the national contest was in Washington. I was very excited. This was a national contest. And Mother went with me to Washington. She says, but in between time, we're going to see Cousin Eva. And I do remember going to Cousin Eva's home and meeting her. I would say I remember being a slender woman and very dignified, tall, and we had tea with her that day. That was my only meeting with Cousin Eva.
But the fact is, Brooklyn is not boring. But our churches, synagogues, and mosques have more than just great acoustics. What they do is bring people together and make them understand the importance of the human condition.
We have been talking about the role of Plymouth Church in the Underground Railroad, and a number of churches were active in it, and that was really Christians acting out their faith 150 years ago, and they still do. 3 weeks after the Pinky auction, Abraham Lincoln came here. He had thought he was going to give a speech here, and he arrived on a Saturday for a Monday speaking engagement and had been told that because there was ice in the river, the Manhattan Republicans wanted the speech moved into Manhattan. So they agreed to move the speech to Cooper Union. That's why Bill Clinton came to Cooper Union several years ago and not to Plymouth Church. What should have been the Plymouth Church speech was the Cooper Union speech. But that's the speech at which Lincoln stated his position on slavery. It was an essential cornerstone to his becoming nominated for President of the United States. And that speech would have been given here. But because he lost the opportunity to speak here on Monday, he attended services here on Sunday. We have the Lincoln Pew. There's a plaque on it. After that morning worship service, he went with Reverend Halliday, who was at one time an assistant pastor here, and he visited a shelter for homeless children. Well, then he went up to New England and went campaigning, came back here to Plymouth 3 weeks later to hear Beecher preach again, and this is the only church in metropolitan New York Lincoln attended. Oral tradition has long had it that Plymouth Church was one of the stops on the Underground Railroad, and we're going to see the basement of the church, which is where runaway slaves fleeing to freedom are believed to have been hidden. But most of the basement, you'll see, is very much like it must have been when the runaways came to Brooklyn. We're going under a brick arch. The exterior walls are stone. The interior arches and walls are brick. Down a step, which must be original. And on either side here, there are chambers or rooms. Two wonderful old tree trunks, this one and one over there. Oh, what are they, 8-10 inches in diameter? No, yes, diameter. Holding up the ceiling. Here is the exterior wall of the old church, I think, original church, and above it, it looks like a large red light bulb. I'm told it's a fire extinguisher. You take it down and throw it on the fire. There's always been a tradition that there was a tunnel that led down to the water, and when the sidewalk on Hick Street was excavated a couple of years ago, was open for a day or two, I think for sewer repairs, there was what looked exactly like a tunnel under the sidewalk. This has always been my theory as to where it connected inside the church. This is where Henry Ward Beecher preached for the first 2 years of his ministry in Brooklyn. Well, not down here in the basement, up above us. I've always thought they didn't stay here permanently. They came here to find a better location in Brooklyn. You can see the metal fire door added after the fire of 1920 with the relatively modern brick above it. But then beside that brick and beside the fire door is old stone. And there is our tunnel. We're going through a long, narrow tunnel, not even 3 feet wide. On either side, the basement is unexcavated, and there are unfinished, wide, old boards holding back the rubble and the dirt.